Origins of Racism and Violence and a Possible Solution. Once again, the origins of racism and violence and a possible solution. So I hope this topic is of interest to you. I'm going to start talking about it. I can see that you're all joining me, and I'm going to start right now talking about the origins of racism and violence and a possible solution. So before I even start on the topic, I want to read something to you from actually a very distinguished scholar, and what he says. Let me read from a very distinguished scholar on the origins of race and origins of human behavior and origins of migration and so forth. So I'm looking at my notes right now, and I will find this material. The quote is from Dr. Spencer Wells. He was in charge of a geographic project looking at societies and their origins. And this is a quote from him. He says, "You and I and everyone all over the world, we are literally African under the skin. We are brothers and sisters separated by a mere 2,000 generations. Old-fashioned concepts of race are not only socially divisive, but scientifically wrong. 99.9% of human genes are identical and do not fit its physical categories." Now, as an interesting insight, I was looking at the genetics of the Semitic races, looking at the patriarch of the Semitic peoples, Abraham, who's basically the patriarch of Jews, Christians, Muslims. And if you were to look at the Arabs and the Palestinians and the Israelis and the Jews, you would find that 70% of Jewish men and half of all Arab men whose DNA was studied, their Y chromosome has the same paternal ancestor. So basically, Jews and Arabs are first cousins. Same father, different mothers. But go back a little more, and what you see is that all of us have our ancestors from Africa. It doesn't matter where you are. Okay, you could be in the United States, you could be in Alaska, you could think you're an Eskimo or Chinese or Japanese or Vietnamese or Nordic or English or European or Canadian or South American, but actually all of us are African. Early humans first migrated out of Africa into Asia about 2 million years ago. And early Africans or early humans migrated to Europe about 1 million years later. So they migrated to Asia 2 million years ago and to Europe about 1 million years ago. Humans have existed as Homo sapiens only 200,000 years. So before that, there were many kinds of humans, maybe even up to 20 kinds of humans. Neanderthals, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, on and on, Homo floresiensis, etc. So the same family, humans, but different species. And all the species that I mentioned, other than Homo sapiens, were wiped out because of Homo sapiens. We, human beings, got rid of all the other humans. And apparently that's because we were the first storytellers. We developed a language for telling stories, and we created models, and as a result of stories, we created culture. As a result of culture, we created money, rituals, marriage, birth, everything. Birth rituals, adolescent rituals, death rituals. We created music, architecture, all of that, because we had a mind and a brain that was capable of giving meaning to raw experience, to sensations, images, feelings, thoughts. And once we gave meaning, we created stories. And then the whole history of human drama, civilization, is the exchange of stories, mythical stories, religious stories, scientific stories, on and on. And of course, gossip, the most frequent story. But because we started storytelling, we became the dominant species of civilization, as we call it, of planet Earth. And we basically caused the extinction of other humans, but also many other species. And that's where we are. Why do Europeans and Japanese and Asians and Africans and Canadians and Latin American people all look different? And why are they different if they're the same biological and genetic organism? If they're exactly the same genetically, why do they look different? Why are they different? Why do they behave differently? Why do they have different cultures? My theory is that it all has to do originally with climate. So climate and climate and geographical conditions have a lot to do with epigenetic modification, which is the activity of genes that creates our biology, our appearance, and everything else, including ultimately the color of our skin, depending on the amount of sun exposure we have. But if you understand epigenetics and evolution, which is a very new field, epigenetics and evolution, it is suggested that changes in gene expression via mechanisms such as DNA methylation, histone acetylation, and microRNA acetylation, these changes can be actually inherited as activities. And when these epigenetic changes are heritable, they can influence evolution. So the evolution of organisms, including plants, animals, is influenced by epigenetics, the environment. And both the external environment, the climate, the soil, the microbiome, the weather patterns, the humidity, the flora, the fauna, the entire entanglement of genetic information expresses itself as varying genetic activities that create varying appearances. But under the skin, the same genetic information, almost identical, and all coming from Africa. All coming from Africa. So we are Africans. If you're African American, then you don't have to be black. You can be white and be an African American because you're a US citizen and your origins are Africa. If you're African Canadian, you're African. If you're Vietnamese, Indian, Chinese, Nordic, you're African. First thing is to admit that. Second thing is to look at our history. Okay, first I've given you the history of mass migrations from Africa, but then there is more history, the conquest of Africa and all colored peoples by white colonialists who were Africans to begin with. So they go back to the land of their origin and they subjugate the descendants of their ancestors as their slaves and bring them in servitude to their colonies. They did in the West Indies, in the United States, in Canada, in Latin America. These are descendants of the ancestors of white colonialists. So basically, white colonialists took their first cousins, Africans, Asians, everyone else, colored people, brought them into servitude and in many cases slavery, 400 years of slavery in the West, and who were they enslaving? Their first cousins. But that has epigenetic ramifications. The subjugated and those that are brought into servitude ultimately get resentment, inflammation, biological expressions of anger, resentment, hostility, inflammation, chronic disease, poverty, etc., because they've been programmed for servitude. And then those who were the conquerors, epigenetically, they create a mindset and a culture of the conquerors. Never mind that the conquerors committed rape, murder, pillage, took away all the natural resources, put them in the Tower of London, etc., etc. Never mind all that. The fact is that epigenetically, the white colonialists were programmed to be conquerors, and that influenced what we may call their self-image, not self-esteem, because self-esteem comes from knowing the true self, but their self-image influenced that into mighty conquerors, and the same way those that were conquered, their self-image was influenced in the direction of servitude, slavery, resentment, and anger. Those are the facts. That's the past. We can't change it. But look at the present and the symptoms of that. Violence, everything that we see now as disease, acute and chronic, is based on zip code. And zip code is based on literally wealth and opportunity and education. And so the cycle repeats itself, generation after generation after generation. And so we now have a movement, thankfully, for social justice, for racial justice. We have a movement, Black Lives Matter, but is that enough? And it's not, because we're not looking at the real story, which is the past, the present, and the future that we can create. We can let the past go. We can look at the present with full awareness, and we can reimagine the future. But for that, social activism is not enough. For that, we have to change our collective story. We have to know the past story. We have to recognize the injustice. We have to know what the consequences are to our present story. And then we have to envision the future story. For me, the future story is only one thing: a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier, and joyful world. And I believe that we can make that happen if we all participate in changing our personal story and then our collective story. So my personal story, I'm a descendant of people who were indentured workers, some of them. One of my ancestors was murdered by the British because he refused to give up his land. Another one of my ancestors was knighted by the British because he discovered the benefits of Rauwolfia serpentina, which is an alkaloid that ultimately resulted in a pharmaceutical for treating high blood pressure. So one of my ancestors was knighted by the British. He was a knight of the British Empire. Another was murdered. That's my history, and I'm a product of that. And I face it. It's the fact. But it also influences, of course, my modes of thinking, my modes of knowing, my modes of feeling, my modes of behavior, because I'm a product of history. Economic history, cultural history, religious history, mythological history, on and on, that goes back to the Bronze Age and the Iron Age and to hunter-gatherers and all the influences that have happened since then. That's who I am. And that's who you are too, product of history. Okay, but now what's the future? How are we going to create the future? First is by embracing our own history. Second is letting go of it, being fully aware of it, and saying, what can we learn from that history? All of us. Second, look at the current situation and recognize that it's totally unacceptable. Okay, if we go this way, we're headed for extinction. And thirdly, let's write a new story. How can I be more peaceful? Peace can only be created by those who have peace within. Love can be shared only by those who have loved. Okay, so how can I create peace in my life, love in my life? How can I be an embodiment of social justice? How can I be an embodiment of racial equality? How can I be a champion for climate sustainability? How can I be healthy myself and joyful myself? And I guarantee you, if enough of us do that, we'll have a new story for humanity, reaching critical mass for a more peaceful, just, sustainable, and healthier world. So the origins of racism and violence are very easy to understand, but the solutions are not going to be overnight. The solutions are requiring your participation, my participation, our collective participation here online and locally in our communities. So if we can create those communities of seva, service, sangha, community, simran, remembrance of our past and our true spiritual nature as divine beings, and the entanglement of genetic information that creates the exuberance of life and existence, then we will have a possible solution. So what do you think? I would love to hear your feedback. You are all apparently agreeing with me. So let's go for it. Wayne asks, chakra clearing. Yes, if we clear all the chakras, we are happy, healthy, fulfilled, and we can become the catalyst, the enzymes for creative health, well-being, and happiness. Delaney Kaipar says he loves this. So thank you, Delaney. And thank you, Sherry Hayes. And thank you, thanks all of you. Anahita, thank you. Thank you. Let's do it. Let's find the solution to all these ills by finding the solutions within ourselves. Okay, my friends, thank you. I'll see you tomorrow.